Normally, actual output is often measured on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. But when they talk about business cycles, they create a confusion. Often they do that with actual output level. So if actual output level shows the line going down, that means the rate of change is negative. All right? So if actual output level line is going down, the rate of change will be negative, and therefore definitely it's a recession. All right? Definitely recession. In fact, a deep recession when actual output level is falling. But recession need not necessarily be actual output level falling. Recession can be a situation where for a few successive quarters, quarter means 3 months, few successive quarters, the growth rate starts falling, or the rate of change value starts declining, say from 8% to 7% to 6% to 5%. That is also recession. In fact, that is called recession. And a negative rate of change all right, where the output level itself is falling is a severe case of recession. That is often depression. Now, the arithmetical error he pointed out, but I didn't pay much attention. Usually rate of change in discrete data we measure as yt minus 1 over yt minus 1. And if you use calculus, then it should be dy dt divided by y. I wrote only dy dt. This is what he pointed out. So you should correct in the previous diagram what I wrote in the last class, previous class, as rate of change as y dot is not correct. It will be y dot over y, which in discrete time it will be yt over yt minus 1 over yt minus 1. This divided by y was missing. In the previous class, I wrote dy dt, which is not correct. It should be dy over y into dt. An arithmetical error I made using calculus notation of calculus to measure rate of change. All right. Now, what I was talking about is these business cycles, which are essentially short-run phenomena. And you have macro models to study them called short-run macroeconomic models, short-run and long-run, short-run and medium-run macroeconomic models. And then you have long-run macroeconomic models where a longer time frame is taken, 10 years or so, and a very long run can be 20 years, 40 years, 50 years, 100 years, whatever. Now, if you have observed, if one watches the data, how it behaves, one does find very interesting situations. In the 80s, late 70s, 80s in the Western world, and India witnessed that in the 60s, I have seen data, you have a situation where you have chronic unemployment, economy is in deep recession, and you have a very high inflation. And economists found it very difficult to explain why is the situation where you have chronic unemployment and you have very high inflation, because they were believing in Keynesian models, and Keynesian models were demand management models. So if any ill of the economy is there, demand curve can shift and correct. So if demand curve shifts and corrects recession, what you would find, the growth rate should be high, maybe. But you cannot have a situation where growth rate is negative, output falling, and high inflation. Demand curve shifts do not create that. So it's something else which was creating it in the economies, where you have high inflation and low output level. And if I go back to the demand and supply diagram, what you will find is that if you draw a diagram, say Y is output and P is price, and you have a demand curve called aggregate demand in macroeconomics, aggregate demand, and you have aggregate supply curve, then any demand shift to cure the economy would involve higher output as well as higher prices. You take any artificial shift in the demand curve. What you see, the intersecting point is going from here to here, where you have higher prices and higher output level. So growth rate, high growth rate in an economy can be associated with inflation in a dynamic framework. It's a static framework. We don't have inflation here. We have a kind of indication of price movement. Similarly, if demand is slumping, is shrinking in an economy, and the demand curve shifts backwards, then what you will notice is that low output, a falling output level, and falling prices also, because the economy would move somewhere here. So the prices are coming down, output is also shrinking. But when you had a situation where prices are going up and output shrinking, they realized that Keynesian demand management policies are not working anymore, which they believed in. There is something else going on. And in very simple words, if output is shrinking and prices are increasing, you have shocks in the economy emerging from the supply side. Because if you shift the supply, what you will find is output would shrink and prices would go up. Now, when supply curve disturbances or supply disturbances are creating this, then demand management policies cannot work, because if supply curve is shifted and you shift the demand farther, it may increase some output level, but prices would go up even farther, which is not a very good thing, because you're not controlling inflation. Now you have a situation in economy where you have recession or unemployment with falling output levels or falling growth rate of output levels, along with rising prices, continuously rising prices, inflation. So you have to deal with both. And if in terms of demand and supply diagram, if this is because of supply shocks, then demand management policies cannot work, because demand curves may counter falling output a little bit if you shift it to the right, but it will increase the prices even farther. So inflation will get a boost from demand management policies. So you will not be able to manage both inflation and unemployment problem with demand management policy if you have a situation where falling output level is associated with rising prices, which we called stagflation. That's the word we used. So we need to see what happened therefore. The macroeconomic theory changed, because you can see the solution therefore will have to come from the supply curves, supply management, not demand side. What happened in the recent recession last 2 years in India? Anybody paid any attention? They were talking about inflation. Did you notice that? And falling growth rate of output. Have you heard that? What kind of policy did government of India adopt? No tax breaks as such, money controls, monetary policies, I will talk about that, which are essentially demand management policies. Do you think that would have worked? Demand management policies were controlling money. What would it do? If you're controlling money means reducing demand, I will explain why money is part of demand later. If controlling money, tightening money, which Pranab Mukherjee was doing with the RBI governor, was advising the RBI governor to do that, you are essentially trying to control inflation through shift in aggregate demand, which is backwards. What would happen to the output level then? So what's the result you are getting now? Negative IIP growth, growth rate GDP falling, wrong policy. The policy that UPA 2 government adopted to deal with the macroeconomic problems, where you had a stagflation-like situation, where growth rate is falling and inflation is there, a demand management policy can never work. Huh? What did I teach you since morning today? How can there be priority if you don't control the recession? How can it be a priority if people lose jobs? We don't care. We only care about price control. That's exactly the stagflation I was trying to talk about this morning. That you cannot control both the objectives. You cannot have both the objectives met with a demand management policy. That's what is precisely wrong. But he is finance minister, you are not. You can make that statement, but he cannot. So here, now you would learn why macroeconomic theory, at least a theory course, is important. How you would understand. All right. Now, having said that, we can talk about a little bit more. I would just briefly mention a few things which have become very popular in the literature, which is there in the literature for a long time. And there are a few things I would ad hocly put it on the board today. And then we will get into the end of this topic so that I can start the new topic. We wasted the first two lectures a little bit because you people were not here. Now, when we talk about the growth rate, you must have heard me saying that growth rate is associated with unemployment or employment, which is common sense. If the economy is growing, more output is producing, they must be using more labor services. So more people are getting jobs. It's very simple, common sense. But there was an actual empirical investigation as to when growth rate changes, how is employment, unemployment that is associated. It was done in the US briefly in the past. During the data period they took is 1951 to 2003, and they did an estimate, and let's see whether it makes sense to you or not. This is just an empirical research that was done, is mentioned now in textbooks also. The empirical literature, this is called the Oaken's law. Now, what is this law? I don't know whether people still accept this as law. They use the data period. Oaken is an economist who used the data period, 1951 to 2003, data period they used, and he found the following relationship. I don't know whether it will interest you or not. Percentage change in output is equal to 3.5 percentage minus 2 into change in the percentage unemployment rate. So the percentage change in output that will take place in an economy, if it does, suppose the economy recovers by, suppose the output growth rate falls by 2.5%. So the percentage change in output is minus 2.5%. Now you can solve the change in the unemployment rate that will take place. Minus 2.5% minus, if you take this number to the other side, is minus 3.5%. So how much it will become? 2.5% minus 3.5% is 6%. All right? 6%. So minus 6%, and this is minus 2% into change in the percentage unemployment rate. So unemployment rate, how much will it change? So it will be 3, 2, minus minus will cancel out. So 6 divided by 2, 3 is the change in the percentage unemployment rate. 3 is the number. So our unemployment rate will increase by 3 points. All right. So when the economy's growth rate declines by 2.5% rate point, then the unemployment rate will increase from say 5 to 8%, 3 percentage point. So decline in output by 2.5% will give rise to more unemployment increase percentage wise, which is 3%. So this is a relationship which we often connect, you use, but we don't know exactly how they are related. But this is one attempt that was made by Oaken to find out what the number is. We can find out that number. Problem with India is India doesn't have the unemployment data. So it's very difficult to do it here. All right, this is Oaken's law that I was talking about continuously, and where he, in fact, somebody attempted to measure that in the US. And why is the growth rate shrinking and unemployment is more? Because you can see what companies do. When they hit the recession, they lay off workers. And because of the social pressure or the pressure that exists in the economy that they can be laid off, they make a smaller staff do the work of a bigger number. And the reason is twofold. One, you getting more work done by the existing employee because they are also under the threat they can be laid off. So they're working harder. Second, by laying off people, you save a huge amount of cost for the company, because the companies usually have two kinds of costs which are big. One is when the company is being set up. These are called fixed costs. Buying the land, building the factory, constructing it, buying the machines. Production is yet to begin. Huge amount of fixed costs. This is what is taught in microeconomics. A large amount of fixed costs are there. And once the company starts producing goods, you still incur costs because you pay for the variable costs, the raw materials that you purchase, all right? The other costs, administrative costs, you hire labor, you pay their wages. And when these variable costs begin, the largest amount of cost in the total structure of variable cost is the labor cost. So when the company is in recession, economy is in recession, and company is not selling much, when it tries to cut corners and wants to save costs, the first thing it does is lay off workers. Because you save a huge amount of money by not having to pay the wages, the perks, all right, the insurances, etc., that you are otherwise paying. So labor is at the mercy. It doesn't sell off its capital goods, machine vagara, or land. What it does initially, the initial reaction is to lay off workers. That's how they save a lot of cost. And also make the existing staff which remains work harder, and they are under the gun to work harder. If they don't, they would be laid off too. And if there is unemployment, the company has a good time too, because the company can hire people at a lower cost now. Vis-a-vis when the economy is booming, where the company finds it difficult to hire IIT graduates without paying good salaries. But when the economy is down, they can get easily good IIT graduates, people like you, at a lower salary, because you are not also finding jobs. Do you see how it works? All is common sense, but you have to connect them. Economics is essentially common sense, but you have to connect them. So you see a 2.5% dip in the growth rate of output, national output, macro output, means the macro unemployment rate increases by 3% according to him in the United States. Why is it so? That's why. And also you have these capital intensive methods of production. In modern ages, modern technology, capital intensive methods of production, where earlier you would have had labor hired to do the work, but the machine can do the work of 10 labor. So why you hire 10 labor? Because at the price of 5 labor you can get the machine, and the machine would produce more than 5 labor. These capital intensive methods of production, like even the automobile plants, I have seen shows on TV when they show the assembly line of the automobile plants, modern automobile plants in Western, even in India, they are often using robots. There is a labor standing, making sure that the robot is functioning properly and doing the job, but actually 5 people are not around the car to do the job. It's the robot hand which is moving and putting things in place. So capital has replaced labor. So the quick way of getting rid of labor is one thing. Yes, you had a question. I haven't got your point at all. You stand up and say louder. A smaller amount of output. Earlier they were producing more when the economy was booming. Now the sales have gone down. Recession means your company's demand has gone down, demand for your output. So recession means a macroeconomic phenomenon of falling output income level also means that the demand for goods are going down in the economy. So the company is selling less. So it is not required to keep that extra 1,000 work anymore, labor anymore. And also it does some reorganization, restructuring. Given the present demand and what it will be in the next 6 months, 1 year, it does a forecast and kind of organizes the entire, maybe some of the things which are possible to reorganize. And if it is not selling and profits are falling, then they would try to cut costs, because profit is essentially total sales value minus cost. So A is total sales value minus B is cost. So in order to increase the profit level, either you increase A, which is not possible in recession maybe much, so you cut cost B. So A minus B gap increases and the profit increases. So it does a restructuring. Anyway, let's not get into industrial organization. I talk about that because in this connection. Another thing which became very popular in the 60s when the Keynesian economics was very active, and later it became a debatable issue, a very hot debate used to take place, is the thing called Phillips Curve. And you would understand why the Phillips Curve relationship was acceptable to the macroeconomists at one point and no longer acceptable to macroeconomists later. Because the Phillips Curve essentially says, this is again an English economist, that was an American economist. And here is an English economist with 100 years data, so very long run data. He found out that in the English economy, the inflation in terms of wage increases, you can measure inflation also in terms of wage increases, not just the price increase, because wages and prices are connected with a markup. If a company is paying higher wage, automatically it will increase the price to cover it. So sometimes some economists prefer to measure inflation indirectly through the wage inflation. Wage kitna बढ़ रहा है? Wage is also an indicator of price increases. One reason people say inflation in India is high because of the companies paying a very high wage. People say that. Anyway, we will get into these detailed macroeconomic discussions along with microeconomic theory later. It will crowd your mind. So the Phillips curve is another relationship which became very important in the 60s. And people were very happy that Phillips found this relationship, I tell you. People were very happy. Because essentially what it says, it does make a ground for the demand management, Keynesian demand management policies. What was the Phillips curve? Essentially what he found was, after having used the data and regressed it, he found there's an inverse relationship between something called unemployment rate and something called pi. Pi is the inflation rate. and it is usually measured as prices in this period minus prices in the other period over prices in the other period. You can put a percentage number into 100, you can do. In case of wage inflation, it can also be measured in terms of wages in the current period, wages in the last period, divided by wages in the last period. W is wage, P is price. Phillips was using the wage inflation measure. And unemployment rate, U, the unemployment rate, which is equal to unemployment rate, is also something like the total number of people unemployed over the labor force. This is the total number of people unemployed. And L is the total labor force. This is the total labor force, total number of people unemployed and the total labor force. Total labor force will be total number of people unemployed plus total number of people employed is the total labor force. And you can also do a percentage thing here into 100. What Phillips found was an inverse relationship between inflation rate and unemployment. It went down like this. This is the Phillips curve. Now, this is the Phillips curve. It went on like this. What is it saying? If unemployment has to be reduced, there has to be an inflation, a trade-off. It essentially talks about a trade-off. If this is empirically true, that means in England there is a trade-off that exists or existed for over 100 years. So this is essentially talking about a trade-off. Trade-off between pi and u. This is essentially talking about the trade-off between pi and u. So in the economy, if you have to solve the unemployment problem, or English economy the way it has solved the unemployment problem, but while trying to solve the unemployment problem, it has given rise to some inflation problem. There is a trade-off. And from period to period, that trade-off may have changed the relationship. Essentially, the slope of the curve may have changed. If you take a shorter run within this very long run period, over 100 years data he used. But if you take, say, 40-year data, 30-year data, you would have found the trade-off had shown a particular slope from 1920 to 1950. Prior to 1920, it had another slope. But for the overall period, this kind of a relationship existed, but the slope could have changed. So the trade-off could have changed. Sometimes it is flat, sometimes it is steep. That means, steep means a small decline in unemployment rate. That means people getting more jobs is associated with very high increase in inflation. Whereas if the curve is flat, it is saying a large reduction in unemployment was associated with a smaller amount of increase in inflation. The slope can change. In India, if you want to do that, we may find a different slope. Now, the point is, if you go back to the demand and supply diagram I had, it clearly says, if you're trying to solve the recession or unemployment problem through a demand management policy, what would happen? The demand curve shifts to the right. As soon as the demand curve shifts to the right and intersects the upward sloping supply curve to the right, you have output increasing, but at the same time price is also increasing. And Oaken's law is saying that output increases is associated with decline in unemployment rate. So the Phillips curve has a sound basis in our understanding of the macroeconomy. But when the demand management policies started not working, they started failing in the 70s and the 80s, late 60s, and you had no such solution possible, then the Phillips curve became invalid. Then people started fighting between various camps, Keynesian and non-Keynesian camps, as to who is correct. And what happened was, after that debate, many people agreed that this is a very short run phenomenon, the short run phenomenon, which is Keynesian economics. But no such relationship for a long run exists. I will tell you why exists, because it was irritating a number of classical macroeconomists. They don't want to see this kind of a relationship in the long run. So in the short run that might exist, but in the long run we don't believe it at all exists. They started saying, and they said in the long run, they said a very interesting thing. They said if this is the short run, and in the long run the Phillips curve is like, the long run Phillips curve is like this. This is the long run Phillips curve. Which has no trade-off, it's absolutely a vertical line. And this phenomenon, downward sloping line, is essentially a short run Phillips curve. And they tried to prove this using data. Now in the long run, if it is vertical, what it is saying, there is no trade-off. All right? And they are also saying the value on the x-axis here has been fixed. If there is no trade-off, you may not be restricting the value on the y-axis variable, but you are restricting the value on the x-axis. It cannot change anymore. It's a very rigid variable. This is also you are saying. So these people who were saying that in the long run the Phillips curve is vertical and no trade-off exists, that is demand management policies don't work anymore, are also saying that in the long run you cannot be influenced, the unemployment rate, because it is fixed. This is very interesting. So it is getting very murky. U cannot be changed. So this U, or this small u, becomes a small u star, and this star variable is very interesting variable. This star variable, according to classical macroeconomists, we'll have to find that out later. The star variable, u star, according to classical macroeconomists, this u star has a name. This is called the natural rate of unemployment. Star is called the natural rate of unemployment, or natural unemployment rate. What is natural unemployment rate? I tried to find out. You can try to find out from textbook yourselves. Natural unemployment rate is like a long run unemployment rate which remains in the economy. Some people won't be employed. It's just like the unemployment associated with full employment I explained in the previous class, that even if the economy is in full employment, all people are employed. There are some people who do not have jobs, but that is basically a voluntary thing. They preferred not to work in the offers that came to them, and they want to wait out a month or 15 days or 2 months for a better job. So that unemployment is essentially frictional unemployment. It's called frictional unemployment. So natural rate of unemployment is something like that, where it's a long run unemployment, and the classical macroeconomists, when you will see their model, you will see them soon, this week probably, you will see that in the classical models, macro models are the new classical macro models, where they essentially talk about long run, they essentially talk about natural rate of unemployment. Therefore, they must be talking about full employment always. Because if the unemployment is only natural rate of unemployment, which is voluntary, the economy must be fully employed. The question that arises, the economy doesn't remain in the long run. We do see in US, in the Western world, a lot of people over the last 2-3 years who are unemployed, looking for a job, not finding a job. The economy is definitely not fully employed. So you don't have natural rate of unemployment. You have more than natural rate of unemployment. So the Phillips curve is no longer vertical, probably there. and don't think that people are happily unemployed, that इतना काम है, हमको अच्छा नहीं लग रहा, मैं थोड़ा wait कर जाऊँ. A month, 2 months, half a year, I have enough savings in my bank. And I will get a better job, then I will start working. Ye freedom, ye privilege, ye pleasure, I don't think exists in the Western world today. So the problem therefore becomes between a fight between short run and long run macroeconomics. Nobody wants to budge. The long run macroeconomics, like the classical macroeconomics, believes in long run, doesn't understand that economies do go through short run periods of severe unemployment, where it is not frictional unemployed, chronically unemployed people, as in the United States or Europe today. All right? Clear? So this is kind of the Phillips Curve story. Very important debates used to take place surrounding these things. And what I'm doing, I'm trying to tell you some empirical side of macroeconomics, which have now taken root as theoretical components or components of theoretical models also. So when one sets up a theoretical model, one often writes an equation to describing the Phillips curve in the model. It's just not an empirical exercise that data is saying it. Empirical exercise means data is saying it. But the theoretical laboratory type experiment we do in social science, writing equations, describing relationships through those equations, writing variables like inflation, unemployment, employment, output growth rate, whatever, does have an equation sometimes, a structural equation called Phillips curve. So I thought I'd make you aware of it. Don't get nervous if you find them in books. But I don't want to talk much about that. Now I'm going to come to the end and sum up this topic. Now, having gone through the background story in macroeconomics, and essentially what I'm trying to do, put into your mind what macroeconomics does, what it deals with. Now, what my course would do, the remaining portion of the course, except the next topic, is that essentially talk about construct macro models, theoretical models, and we'll find them how useful they are over time as we go through that. So, how do we construct macro models? Well, macro models, theoretical models, essentially has three components. Macro models. The three components are as follows. These three components they call three markets, aggregate markets. All right. Before I go into the three aggregate markets, let me tell you that a macro model is very similar to a micro model that you learn the first day you open an economics textbook. As soon as you open an economics textbook after the definitions, what they essentially tell you is that there is a demand curve for a good. An individual can have a demand curve for a good. A market demand can also exist. And there is a supply curve of a good, which either one person is supplying or many producers are supplying. There are supply curves of goods. And the market reaches an equilibrium when demand intersects supply. In macro model, we essentially do the same thing. We think that there is an aggregate demand side which becomes an aggregate demand function later. And also there is an aggregate supply side. And therefore, in order to construct a macro model, we will have to describe the aggregate demand side and the aggregate supply side. Depending upon the assumptions you make about the aggregate demand side and the aggregate supply side, you therefore categorize yourself as a classical macroeconomist, new classical macroeconomist, Keynesian macroeconomist, whatever. New Keynesian macroeconomist, depending upon the assumptions you make. But one doesn't go outside this boundary wall of a macro model, which essentially has two components, aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Like belonging to a political party. Depending upon the policies you announce, you essentially align yourself with either the BJP or the left parties or the Congress or whatever, depending upon the policies you have. Similarly here, depending upon the assumptions which also lead to policy issues, you align yourself with the classical macroeconomic side or a Keynesian side, a new Keynesian, new classical, whatever. Now, on the aggregate demand side, structurally talking about, there are two components to the macro models. Two essentially, one, we have to describe the goods market, which is also sometimes known as the goods and services market, and also we will have to describe the money market. Goods market and the money market. And on the aggregate supply side, when we talk about that, what we essentially do is nothing but we talk about the labor market. So these three markets, goods market, money market and labor market, constitute, once you have described them, you have a complete macro model. So when I would take up now the classical macro model or the Keynesian macro model, these are the two basic macro models. I will discuss them in details. That will take up most nearly the entire course, along with some other things. My job will be done. I would be essentially talking about these three components. And you will see how the differences would arise. The differences would slowly surface in front of your eyes. And you would also realize this is so much of a macroeconomics debate. A debate in macroeconomics is so much a political debate in the Western world. You will see that immediately. Now when you would listen to the speeches and the policies, you would know, acha, what kind of model or theoretical framework they have in mind. So therefore, which political party they also align themselves with. That also you would know. Either Democrat or a Republican. Or in England, you would say the Labour Party or the Conservative Party. Labour Party would typically be a Keynesian type macroeconomic policies. The Conservatives would typically have a classical type macroeconomic policy framework. Now, there are issues here, we would go into that later. Many people have asked me, students in the past, sir, in the market here, we don't see the stock market, which is so important. Where is the stock market? Sir, you should you should talk about the stock market, they used to say. I said, that's a very good question. This is a very clever thing that macroeconomists usually do. They keep the stock market in the background and they connect it with the money market. So having focused to discuss the money market, they can now, through that connection, like a tunnel, they can go to the stock market and can tell you what is happening in the stock market. So they are connected, but not explicitly on the board there as a separate market to be modeled. That doesn't mean stock market models just focusing on stock market doesn't exist. There's enormous literature on capital theory and financial economics, finance, which doesn't do anything but study in details how the stock market functions or the issues related to stock market. But in the macro model under economics called macroeconomics, we do not directly deal with the stock market. We keep that in the background, and how we keep that in the background often textbooks don't tell you, but I would tell you. It's not ignored, but it is in the background. So anything happening in the money market would tell you therefore what will be happening in the stock market. And the goods market is often in macroeconomics called goods and services market. I'm ignoring that word because in a macroeconomy you just don't produce goods, you produce services also. In microeconomics often you talk about a company producing a product, shirts, watches, furniture, company producing it, bicycles, automobiles. But from the macroeconomic point of view, it's like the father looking at the entire family. You don't ignore the girl child, you don't ignore your wife, you don't ignore your mother who is present. So from the macroeconomic point of view, you have the goods produced and services also. In fact, many of you would be working in service related companies. You won't produce any goods. Software companies, outsourcing companies, Narayan Murthy's company, it doesn't produce any good. It produces services. Lawyers produce services. Doctors give you medical services. IS officers, bureaucrats don't produce goods, produces services. MPs, MLAs, ministers, take it. Even Jharudas here, electoral complex people, me, what am I producing? Am I producing any good? I am giving you some services called education. So in the macroeconomic sense, the words always you will find in these books, they are talking about goods and services. But you go to a microeconomics book, you will see a company, a firm producing a product, a firm producing a good. Always the example, hypothetical example is always in terms of a good. But in macroeconomics, we make sure, but I have ignored that word services there. All right? So goods and services, money market and labor market. So my task will be to bring them up together, these structural features. And how we would proceed with the macro model and the policy issues is very simple. Is that after having described a macro model which we think roughly describes our country or an economy, modern economy, then we look into various what are known as something like, they are called comparative static exercises. We look into something called comparative static exercises. You are wondering, sir, this is a very difficult word. Sounds like we are in a philosophy course. We are not. It's a very simple thing to understand. What are these exercises? Comparative static. If you look at the demand curve, if you remember, if you look at the demand curve, when you have a good here and a price, and you have demand, and you have supply, market, demand and supply, this is a static framework. It's not a dynamic framework where the variables do not have a time derivative. P and Y, absolute values, not a time derivative, not a P dot, Y dot. This static framework gives you a static equilibrium point where the two curves intersect, and because of opposite forces, they balance each other and they remain in equilibrium. Comparative static exercise essentially means what we will do. Suppose there is a shock, a supply shock or an aggregate demand shock which shifts the curve, and you reach a new equilibrium point. Suppose there is a demand shock. We reach a new equilibrium point. Then comparative static exercise essentially means when we reach the equilibrium point, how far is it? How far did we go? What are the changes that took place? So from here, this diagram, we can see that the prices have gone up, and from the output level we can see that the output has gone up. So compare means we compare two static equilibrium points. We compare two static equilibrium points after generating an artificial shock to the system, which can be used to understand when in the real economy an actual shock takes place. Either the oil prices in the world has gone up, or there is a world recession, the financial market clamped down, or crisis in the Western world, or there is a war in the Middle East. How does these shocks start affecting your economy? Like if you stand on the seashore, all right, there is a storm thousands of miles away. How is it affecting your coastline? You see the waves are rising, or say in case of a tsunami, there's an earthquake in Indonesia, the tsunami is felt in Kerala. All right? Either it can be a distant shock or it can be a very close shock. And when these shocks occur in real life, it does occur. Comparative static exercise is essentially what we will do algebraically, is to try to measure how much the changes are in the variables. particularly endogenous variables. These comparative static exercises are often referred to in textbooks and are described in terms of something called multipliers. These are also called something called multipliers. All right? And I will explain why they are called multipliers. And not only that, these comparative static exercise method would also allow us to study the implications of various government policies. And the two kinds of policies that we would continuously talk about in this course are known as the fiscal policy and the monetary policy. I will explain them to you. So when we will talk about the fiscal policy and how it can improve or whatever it can, how it can affect the economy, essentially we would talk about comparative static exercises, and our explanations are in terms of multiplier. Suppose we say this fiscal policy type A is more effective than fiscal policy type B. What we are essentially doing is that in type A, what is the value of the multiplier? And in type B, what is the value of multiplier? We compare the two numbers, simple numbers. And if one number is bigger than the other number, we say that is more effective. So these comparative static exercises, which are in terms of multipliers, will also be used to talk about policies, government policies, called public policies. Fiscal policy in macroeconomics. In different areas of economics, we have different kinds of policies to be discussed. In macroeconomics, the two conventional sets of policies that we discuss are fiscal policy, which has to do with the finance minister, taxes, etc., government spending, and monetary policy, which has to do with the central bank of the country. In our case, is the Reserve Bank of India, what they do. So the headquarter of monetary policy in any country is the central bank. The headquarter of fiscal policy in any country is the finance ministry. That's what we do. And you have seen why policies are required. In business cycles, I told you, the economy is hotting up too quickly. It has a tendency to crash. So we require appropriate policies to control it. So it doesn't increase too quickly, climbs up slowly, remains there at a higher level, comes down again slowly. All right? And if an indisciplined or a wayward child, we are trying to control. All right? Which is not going to sound or look very funny probably. Suppose there is a very indisciplined little child, we are trying to control. So what we did, we had a small string on his left palm, another string on his right leg, all right, and he tries to run too quickly, we pull them. So, and we have a soft cover on the floor so that when he falls, he doesn't hurt himself. So he's not allowed to run so quickly. If you want to run slowly, so the strings won't be pulled. The economy, that's how policies are also used, not only to recover from a recession, but also to control the movement of the economy so that it doesn't become very wayward, there are not too many sharp changes. Policies are required, all right. Now, the last bit of point that I want to measure, and then I start a new topic, I've already said. Therefore, macroeconomics, as I've been telling you, is so much aligned with the political systems and the political debates of a country that by looking at the models, you can clearly say which is a macroeconomics debate that takes place, whether it's a Keynesian type or a classical type or whatever. And that will be called the schools of thought. The schools of thought. Initially, there used to be, after Keynes's General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money in 1936, there became two schools of thought. But when Keynes was a student, there used to be only one thinking of macroeconomics called the classical macroeconomics. Imagine, my teachers are classical macroeconomists, I become Keynes, which is preaching. We started preaching completely opposite what my teachers taught me. So probably they became the greatest of enemies after that, the teacher and the student. Schools of thought, the classical, these are the original two groups, and the Keynesian school of thought. And essentially I told you the classical school is more into long run macroeconomic models, and the Keynesian is more short run and medium run. And the classical school doesn't believe that government can do anything to the economy. It's in the long run equilibrium. Unemployment is natural rate of unemployment. That is, the economy is fully employed, and the economy cannot do anything about it. Very interesting. And typically what they had to prove that point is the supply curve, they make it vertical. If the supply curve is vertical, demand management policies cannot work. Demand can only push up and down the prices. X-axis value is fixed. But when Keynes came, he made the supply curve normal, upward sloping. So if supply curve shifts, there can be effects. If demand curve shifts, there can be effects, both on prices and output. So Keynesian policy is more of government intervention is sometimes required, useful and effective. Classical economics are like ideal situations they take, a polar extreme. They say no way government intervention can work in the economy. Government should not intervene. Politically, we find typically these two parties. Republicans would believe in US, and the conservatives in England. In Europe, elsewhere also you have the same thing. We call the rightists, the right parties. The extreme right parties are the classical macroeconomists. In some ways they believe in classical macroeconomics. And the more you get left, socialist, more government intervention, etc. are useful, you start believing them. And extreme left, if you go to socialism, then you go into complete government control. I'm not going to talk about that. An extreme right you get, you say government has zero role to play, which is never happening in any country. Government always has some role to play. Question is how much role it has in the economy. Government has the defense, government has the police forces, government has the bureaucrats, the ministers, all sorts of activities. Even they are getting into healthcare, pension, because the private sector is not taking care of them. So government is getting into a lot of activities. So that is either not true. All right. Then from the classical macroeconomists, there are two offshoots, and broadly speaking, there are two kinds of things that happened. One was the monetarists. The monetarists. The other one was the new classical school. All right. So the new classical macroeconomics and the monetarists. So monetarists and new classical macroeconomists, monetarists essentially are saying, basically what they were saying is that money supply is the most important role. This is the classical framework they have. So do not fool around with money supply. If you push it too high, then inflation will be a problem. And the new classical macroeconomics completely uprooted the existing theoretical framework of macroeconomics, and they had a different way of dealing with the situations. They believed in something called the classical belief, but they also said that agents in an economy are rational. They had something called rational expectations hypothesis. So agents are rational in the sense agents know exactly what the government is doing in particular. So government cannot have a policy and have it effective if agents know what government wants to do, and the belief or disbelief is so much, the mistrust, that the private agents, economic agents like you and me and the companies, everybody, cannot be fooled by government policy. So better government lay off your hands from the working of the economy. They have a new classical macroeconomics had a framework with different algebraic formulation, assumptions like rational expectations, which is called rational expectation hypothesis. I may not be able to get into that. And the new Keynesian also developed, which got more into various kinds of Keynesian assumptions about market rigidities. Keynes had an assumption about market rigidities. I would explain that later. So they got into something called the new Keynesian into market rigidities, etc. New Keynesian macroeconomists, monetarists or monetarist, and the new classical macroeconomics. So I need not go into all this. At this stage, if I get time, I will go through them, the rational expectation models of the new classical macroeconomics. So we would be dealing with macroeconomic models, but before we do that, well, I told you about macroeconomic models and the various schools of thought that existed. The interested reader can go into that and try to find out this, what these new classical, new Keynesian macroeconomics people, what are they saying different from the previous ones, their predecessors. Now I go to topic 2, and topic 2 is, topic 1 is over, I begin topic 2. Don't think topic 1 I won't ask any question in exam. I will ask question from topic 1, but topic 2 now onwards will get very specific. Topic 2 is measurement of aggregate economic variables. That we are talking about output, inflation, etc. I want to give you an idea about how these variables are measured. All right. So today I begin topic 2. Measurement of aggregate economic variables. This is the topic again going to remain with us in the next few lectures. Measurement of aggregate economic variables. All right? Okay. Now, before I go into the measurement of aggregate economic variables, I would have a bird's eye view of, or a conceptual framework that we use in macroeconomics before we try to measure the variables. In fact, the measurement of variables is based on this kind of a conceptual framework. The conceptual framework, the first part of this topic, is known as circular flow of income, output, and expenditure. Circular flow of income, output, and expenditure. Macroeconomists think that there is a circularity in the activities of a country. They are tied up. And how is this tied up? The example I will show you, I can complicate it, but I don't want to complicate it at this stage, but we can do that, is that normally the simplest form of this, the demonstration of circular flow of income, output, and expenditure emerges from the fact that your salary from a company tomorrow when you get hired is their expenditure. All right? And their expenditure, which is in terms of salary to you, is collected from the output that they have produced and sold in the market. So they are all connected. All right? They are not in isolation. So suppose I say there are two groups of economic agents in this simple model. There are two groups of economic agents. One called households, the other one called firms. No government, nothing. How do they interact? The way macroeconomists see them. These two groups of economic agents, means who carry out economic activities, they interact in the following fashion. First, households supply two groups of factors of production to the firms. What are they? Households supply two groups of factors of production called labor and organization. To firms. Households supply labor and organization to firms. Firms in return supply something called income, wages and profit to the household sector. The firms in return supply something called income, wages and profits to households, which they supply. On the other hand, firms also supply the goods that households require the various goods, and households from the wages and income that they receive makes expenditures and complete the cycle here. These wages and profits are nothing but income, goods that I have mentioned are nothing but output, and expenditures have been mentioned as expenditures. This is a simple, complete circle, a circular flow, a phase diagram, or no, not a phase diagram, a circular flow of output, income and expenditure that one can conceptualize happening in the macroeconomy. You work for somebody, you get paid, and you offer the services. They produce something from the services and offer you income and also the output. Now you can complicate this diagram by bringing in the third group of economic agents which are not considered to be part of the economy. Important to remember, not considered to be part of the economy. Economy consists of households and firms, but not part of the economy. Something like a moon or a sun sitting outside the world is called the government. Government is never considered to be part of the economy in macroeconomics. You can bring in government and can complicate by putting a government somewhere as a satellite and show how it interacts both with the firms and households in terms of two-way flow. One, supplying goods and services to the household and the firms. You know the services and the goods. They can supply you with public goods. What are public goods? For which you don't pay, like the roads alone, everybody can use them. Parks, bridges, public goods, public services like the defense services, police services. In return, there is a flow of expenditure from the household and the firms which goes as income to the government, known as the tax revenues, etc. I can complement that. But remember, if I draw the satellite called government here, it is a satellite. It is revolving around the private economy. It is not part of the private economy. Moon is not part of the earth, but what moon has can affect earth. Or what moon does, sun does can affect the earth. They are outside. So when we talk about economy, never think government, we are thinking government is also part of the economy. No. There is one error that remains often in people's mind. Because we talk about government all the time, economic policies, government, they are all considered to be outside the economy. and it affects the economy, of course. All right. So this is how you conceptualize the circularity. If you agree with this circularity, if you have no problem, then I can go into the next part, actual measurement of variables. And if you look into the books, the textbooks, etc., the actual measurement of variables also use, very interestingly enough, 3 kinds of methods. One is called the output method, one is called the income method, one is called the expenditure method. 3 kinds of methods they use. Sometimes they are considered to be alternative, sometimes they are essential, whatever. So when we go into the measurement of variables, let's take about the measurement of variables. There are 3, they are called national income. They are called national income accounting methods. 3 national income accounting methods used to measure national output or income. There are 3 methods, and these 3 methods that they use are output method, B, income method, and C, expenditure method. So I have to take them up one by one and talk about that. Output method, income method, and expenditure method. Can you read them? Can you read them, or are you having a problem with the red color? No problem. Okay. Now let's take up output method. Can I erase this part of the board? Diagram copied? Okay. Now let's talk about the output method. Under the output method, when you use that, there are essentially 2 sets of variables that are measured and very popular in the literature. All of you probably know this. Output method is used to measure one variable called GDP and another variable called GNP. You must have heard of these variables, must have. And GDP, there is a relative variable called NDP, and there is a relative variable here called NNP. Often these 2 variables are also used. So these 2 variables are used. They are very popular using the output method. So let me explain that to you. GDP, suppose I want to explain GDP first using the output method. The full expanded form of GDP is gross domestic product, and GNP is gross national product, and NDP is net domestic product, not gross, net, and NNP is net national product, net. Now, using the output method basically means you're looking at or trying to count the value of the total output produced in India, for instance, under GDP. So as if you visit every factory and get the total value of output of goods. So now, suppose you take GDP. What it says? Well, GDP is the value of, you may like to take notes, GDP is the value of all final goods and services. GDP is the value of all final goods and services. GDP is the value of all final goods and services. Value of all final, very important, final goods and services. But how you get the value of all final goods and services? One is the chair, one is the table. Are you saying 100 Maruti Zen, 200 plus 200 Maruti Suzuki, Maruti Alto, 500 Ford Icon, 1 million chairs, 2 million bicycles? You cannot add them. So they have to be valued using some common denominator, and usually the common denominator is the market price. So the final goods and services, value of all final goods and services, which is very important, produced within the country. This is very important. Either by the domestically owned factors of production or no, let me put it this way. Within the country, by the domestically, not forget about the word either, by the domestically owned factors of production and foreign owned factors. Then valued at current market prices, current underlined, in a given time period. Usually it's the financial year. The given time period usually is the financial year. So it can be domestically owned factors of production and foreign owned factors of production. Within the country, final goods underlined, valued at current market prices. These underlined words are very, very important. Note how it is valued. At current prices in 2012-13, present financial year, 2012-13, it starts at 1st of April of a year, ends in the 31st of March in the following year. Usually these variables has a financial year denomination. Economic variables. How much is produced at various stages in the prices prevailing in this time period? Then adding up is very easy. You are not adding apples and oranges. They are all in rupee value. So in rupee value you count. But it is important to note that not only within a given time period they are produced, they are valued at current market prices, but also they can be produced by us Indians, or if Microsoft opens a company and Americans are working here, or if it is a Microsoft company, maybe hiring Indian people, but using labor service, local labor service with a foreign company which is producing something. Also part of GDP. Remember that. Foreign companies are also part of it. Whatever they are producing in India, GDP. Now, GNP in this connection GNP is only slightly different. GNP. कौन सा chalk पे word है? GNP is only slightly different. GNP says the same thing but produced only by the domestically owned factors of production. Anywhere in the world. That means both within and outside the country. That is both within and outside the country. Indians may be producing something either in India or outside, and that is GNP. Everything else is the same. So if you know the output of an Indian company in Middle East should be part of Indian GDP. Indian GNP. But GDP is different. GDP is saying within India. So within the geography, must have seen Indian map. So within the geographical boundary of the country, whoever is there, either Indian or foreigner producing something, is part of Indian GDP. But if you go outside the country, then it becomes more clumsy. Then GNP is there to help you. Then you take only Indians, what they are doing. You are not concerned about any foreigners. So at one point when the data used to come, I remember, Japan is such a tiny country. You can now tell me, if one is to take the Japan's GNP and GDP value, they used to be markedly different. Indian GNP, GDP value, I have seen how different they are. They are not much. But Japan's GNP and GDP value markedly different. Can you tell me which one was bigger? GNP. They have factories all over the world. Such a tiny country is one of the richest countries. How is it? There are factories all over the world. Compared to how many factories foreign companies are there inside Japan, such a tiny country. If you look at how many Japanese companies are there everywhere, it's unbelievable. So this is the first difference. Now the other major features of it I need to explain. I need time. Yes, I can take one question. You take an average price or at the time of production the price. Those are minor issues, not big issues. Forget about it. If you become a statistician, you have to count the numbers, then you can find out what practitioners are doing it. Basically, the market price has to be taken, current market prices, because there is a variable coming up which doesn't use current market prices with respect to GDP, GNP. So, I am coming to that. Those are very small issues. Those are not big issues. Those statisticians decide which one to take. Average price. In India, prices differ all over the country. There are many such issues, so don't get into that. Nitty-gritty. Broad conceptual framework I am supposed to tell you here. If you want to know more details, you have to go to CSO. There is an organization in Delhi called Central Statistical Organization, which crunches the numbers. You can go and talk to them and find out what they do. Ahmedabad price lete hai ki Lucknow price lete hai, they will tell you which one they take. Prices differ all because of various taxes they have. Prices differ. State taxes, various state taxes there. Even petroleum prices, when they are announced, you notice, petrol, Delhi में एक price, Kolkata में एक price, Bangalore में एक price, Hyderabad में एक price, Chennai में एक price, Bombay में एक price. Everywhere there is a different price. Same product, same country. So don't get into those statistical issues. Acha. What is important is that it has to be within a particular time period, valued at market prices. I am coming to that market price business more. And what I mentioned earlier is the final goods and services. This is the horrendous part. So you're talking about in GNP, GDP, the goods that are final goods. What are final goods? Goods that consumers can use. So you're talking about pots and pans, but not steel sheets. But suppose when you're collecting data, you take the steel plant output value in a year, and then the steel plant output goes in various forms, steel sheets, steel tubes, steel pipes, whatever, into various industries as intermediary products, which are not final products. They will take some final shape there and become an car, or can become a box, can become pots and pans, can become something which consumers would use. Then you have to make sure that the intermediary products value are deducted from the final market price value of goods or output, because the final market price value of the output, pots and pans, etc., and the cars, according to the common valuation process method, they will cover all the costs that have gone into it, add the taxes and the profit margins of the producer, the organizer. But all the costs also include the intermediary cost goods, the cost of intermediary goods that have come in semi-finished goods that have come as inputs from various other industries, aluminum industry, steel plants, rubber factories, whatever, all right, nuts and bolts, etc., whatever that have come. They have all gone into making the final price of a car. So all intermediate products have to be deducted. So essentially, therefore, what you are talking about in this output approach, etc., is that you want to take the value added at every stage of production. There are various stages of production. First is the raw material in the mines, ores. When they are ored, mined, they acquire some value when they reach the steel plant. From the steel plant, when they reach the automobile factory, they acquire more value on that. So essentially, in output method, what you're talking about, the value that is being added at every stage. But in simple form, if you take the final market price as the definition says, then you have to make sure you don't do double counting, because if you have already counted the intermediary goods. But if you go strictly by the definition of final goods, then you haven't counted the intermediary goods output, you haven't sent any statistician or data collector to the steel plants to find out the steel output, and then you haven't sent also somebody to the automobile factory, to the pots and pans factory, to the bicycle factory to get their final goods output. You have to make sure you don't do double counting. It's called double counting. You don't doubly count these things, all right? You don't doubly count these things. So essentially what they are looking into, the philosophical basis of this, is the value added at every stage. For when it reaches the final stage, you are looking into the final value added on top of all the values added. If you add them up and the final value added, you get the total value of output produced in the country. Or if you don't want to get into this value added concept, it's more confusing. If you take the final market price of a final good, like this table I'm using, you make sure you don't take the intermediary good stages where it was a simple log first, it was a simple plant, a tree, then it was cut and brought over to a log factory, and it was given a shape of a wood and some value added when he sold to the carpenter. Then the carpenter added some value and gave it shape, polished it, used the nails and made it a table, which is finally sold to you. All right? So you make sure you don't have the intermediary goods data collected and then also the final goods data collected. Then you would be doing a double counting. So double counting is a very important issue, beside the issue he tried to raise about which price to take, which is much simpler. You take an average price. Okay. You take the end of year price. You take the middle of the year price. You take the price when it has finally left the factory for the market. You take that price. Right? There will be errors. Statistical measures always have errors. but the conceptual part is more important. So all final goods are to be taken into and produced within a country. All right? Okay. What they do, they quickly say this following thing. GNP is equal to GDP plus net factor income from abroad. Net factor income from abroad. Now, what happens when an Indian company goes out and produces? It's part of their GDP. Indian company producing in Kuwait. Part of Kuwait's GDP. Because GDP says you take all foreign and Indian and domestic companies there, all output. लेकिन उनका जो income Indian GNP में आना चाहिए, which should be part of Indian GNP, is often not known to the Indian government if it is a private company. Only that part is known when that company is remitting, sending back some of the income here. It can be the Indian workers they are sending back. It can be the companies, the bosses sending back. The company itself remitting funds, sending back to be deposited. If that company is putting money there, receiving money income there and depositing them in international banks or banks in the local banks, whatever, it's not known to the Indian government. It's not known to the Indian statisticians. Huge problem to count the output that is produced outside the country. Arey bhai, within the country it is so difficult to get the output. I'm coming to that in India. But for any decent country, even it is very difficult to get the numbers, what they're doing outside, unless they're remitting. So this is called factor income. Now imagine the foreign companies in India who are producing are also remitting back home some income. Indian companies who are working out in Kuwait, in Africa, in Europe, in Southeast Asia, wherever, remitting back some income they generated to India back home is recorded then when they're coming to the banks, etc. So what they are doing for the practical purpose of computing the value of GNP, they take the GDP value, which is easy to compute because which is within India. The Indians can sit here and get the data, whatever good data they can get. The foreign component where it is in GNP, when Indians are outside, and no Americans or Englishmen should be in GNP, they have to be deducted. They take a net factor income value. जितना इनकम फॉरेनर्स बाहर भेज रहे, जितने इनकम इंडियन कंपनीज फॉरेन में अर्न करके देश में भेज रहा है, उसका प्लस माइनस कर रहा है. And that what they called the net factor income. And then say, okay, Indian GNP value is this. So conceptually they cannot follow and have a very perfect number for GNP. They are trying in real life, in practice, they are trying to get an approximation of Indian GNP through this net factor income variable, which is having a plus and a minus term. The plus term is when Indians are sending back income, that's the plus term, and the minus term is when the foreigners are sending back income to their countries from India after earning here. That's the minus term. So plus and a minus, जो भी number हो, it can be a plus number, it can be a minus number. Who knows? The net factor income from abroad can be either a plus number or a minus number. There is no theoretical restriction, a priori restriction on the number sign, on the variable sign. But that they will add. If a minus number is added to GDP, then Indian GNP number will be less than GDP. If a minus number, in case of Japan, I was trying to say, it's a huge plus number. So Japanese GNP is much bigger than GDP. I was trying to tell you that. But in practice, this is what they're doing. Are you clear? Everybody? GNP, GDP, these are very common variables. If you are part of economics course, In future, you may not have any scope to take another economics course. All right. So we close the lecture at 12 today.